Every ancient civilization that produced sustained astronomical records called the sun something other than a burning sphere of gas. The Egyptians described Ra as a being that sailed through the underworld each night and fought to return at dawn. The Aztec traditions described the sun as requiring active sustenance to continue moving. The Greeks gave it a driver, Helios with his chariot, who could lose control of it with catastrophic consequences for the earth below. Modern astronomy calls these accounts mythology. Primitive minds making sense of a hydrogen-burning star 93 million miles away. The Book of Enoch describes the sun differently from both modern astronomy and ancient mythology. It doesn't call the sun a fire, and it doesn't personify it as a god with human motivations. It describes the sun as a vessel, something constructed, something that moves along a fixed path, not because of physical law, but because of an assigned schedule. And it describes the interior of that vessel in terms that don't map cleanly onto either ancient religious convention or modern astrophysics. This documentary examines what the authenticated sections of the Astronomical Book actually say, what the genuine open questions in solar science look like when stated accurately, and where the line sits between what the text genuinely contains and what various researchers have proposed it implies. Before we go further, subscribe now if this kind of textual and historical exploration is what you are here for. Every week this channel examines ancient texts, scholarly debates, and interpretive questions at the edges of mainstream scholarship. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The Astronomical Book of Enoch, chapters 72 through 82, is among the oldest, demonstrably datable sections of the Enochic corpus. Aramaic fragments designated 4Q208 through 4Q211, held at the Israel Antiquities Authority in Jerusalem, preserve substantial portions of it, and have been dated by paleographic analysis to the 3rd century BCE. These fragments are real, authenticated, and studied in peer-reviewed scholarship. James Vanderkam of the University of Notre Dame, whose published work on the Enochic tradition is among the most authoritative in the field, has written specifically about the Astronomical Book's unusual character. Its systematic, repetitive, measurement-focused content stands apart from the rest of 1st Enoch in ways that scholars have discussed at length in published form. His observation that it reads more like a technical record than a narrative or theological composition is documented in his published scholarship. The Ethiopian Ge'ez manuscripts are the only source for the complete astronomical book. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church's continuous preservation of 1st Enoch in its biblical canon is documented and historically significant. Ephraim Isaac's 1983 translation from the Ge'ez for the Old Testament Pseudepigrapha series is the standard English scholarly translation. Michael Knibb's 1978 Oxford Critical Edition is the standard critical reference. What the Astronomical Book contains, in its authenticated form, is worth presenting clearly before examining the proposed interpretations built around it. The Astronomical Book describes the sun moving through 12 gates, 6 on the eastern horizon and 6 on the western horizon, one for each month of the year. The sun's path shifts through these gates over the course of the year, entering higher or lower gates as the season advances. This gate system accounts for the changing length of days across the seasons. The sun rises further north in summer and further south in winter, corresponding to different gate positions in the text's framework. The text describes the sun as carried in a chariot, a vehicle moving along its assigned path. Whether this language is best read as a description of a constructed vessel, as poetic personification, or as the ancient world's best available vocabulary for describing observed celestial motion, is a genuine question of interpretation that scholars have engaged with in published work. George Nicholsburg's 2001 commentary addresses this language and its implications within the broader Enochic cosmological framework. The Ge'ez term used for what is inside the sun is a genuine philological question. Isaac's translation renders relevant passages in terms that have been discussed in Enoch scholarship in relation to the broader vocabulary of the Enochic tradition. Whether the word carries the specific connotation of something contained, a burning one who is kept, is an interpretive claim that requires specialist Ge'ez philological assessment to evaluate. The proposed reading is interesting and worth noting as a proposed reading. It is not the settled mainstream translation. The text's central calendrical concern, the 364-day solar calendar versus the lunar calendar, is the most thoroughly documented feature of the Astronomical Book and has been discussed extensively in connection with the Qumran community's calendar dispute with the Jerusalem Temple establishment, as covered in this channel's previous documentary on the Astronomical Book. The coronal heating problem is real, significant, and worth understanding accurately. The sun's photosphere, the visible surface, has a temperature of approximately 5,500 degrees Celsius. The corona, the outer atmosphere extending millions of kilometers beyond the photosphere, has temperatures exceeding 1 million degrees Celsius. This is genuinely counterintuitive. Temperature should decrease with distance from a heat source, not increase dramatically. This problem has been known to solar physicists since the 1940s, when measurements of coronal temperatures first became precise enough to reveal the discrepancy. It remains an active and genuinely unsolved area of solar physics. Multiple mechanisms have been proposed: Alfvén wave heating, magnetic reconnection events, nanoflares, and the current scientific consensus is that some combination of these mechanisms likely accounts for coronal heating, but the relative contributions and the precise physical mechanisms remain subjects of active research and measurement. NASA's Parker Solar Probe, launched in 2018, was designed in part to gather data that might help resolve the coronal heating question. It has flown closer to the Sun than any spacecraft in history, passing through the corona directly. Among its findings are the magnetic field reversals described in the source material, called switchbacks, which are sudden, sharp reversals in the magnetic field direction within the solar wind. These were detected and confirmed and have been the subject of published peer-reviewed papers. Their cause and their relationship to coronal heating are active areas of ongoing research. They do not have a settled explanation. The source material proposes that the boundary between the photosphere and the corona corresponds to the Enochic description of a boundary where the burning one who is kept pushes hardest against its housing. This is a proposed interpretive correspondence. Whether it reflects genuine ancient knowledge of a specific solar physics phenomenon, or whether it reflects a broadly applicable metaphor that can be made to correspond to many physical systems, is a question that the proposed reading cannot resolve on its own. The Maunder Minimum is real and is documented in the historical and scientific record. Between approximately 1645 and 1715, the number of observed sunspots dropped dramatically. Sunspot observations recorded in European astronomical records were nearly absent for approximately 70 years. This period overlaps substantially with the coldest decades of the Little Ice Age in Europe, a prolonged period of lower temperatures that affected agriculture, population, and political history across the continent. The relationship between the Maunder Minimum and the Little Ice Age cooling is studied within climate science. Whether reduced solar activity was the primary driver of the cooling, a contributing factor, or a coincidental correlation with other causes including volcanic activity and ocean circulation changes, is an active area of climate research. The relationship is discussed in peer-reviewed climate science without a settled consensus on the precise causal mechanisms. The Sun's activity did resume after the Maunder Minimum. The 11-year sunspot cycle has continued since. Why the Sun went quiet for approximately 70 years, and why it resumed activity, are questions that solar physicists have proposed explanations for, involving the Sun's internal magnetic dynamics and the behavior of its dynamo, but for which fully satisfying mechanistic accounts remain an area of ongoing investigation. The source material proposes that this corresponds to the Enochic description of periods when the gates narrow and the output of the vessel is deliberately reduced rather than naturally weakened. This is a proposed interpretive correspondence. The Maunder Minimum is real, and its causes are not fully resolved. Whether an ancient text describing gate narrowing was encoding knowledge of solar magnetic cycle anomalies is a question that cannot be settled from either the scientific data or the textual evidence alone. The Carrington Event of September 1859 is real and is one of the most significant documented solar events in recorded history. British astronomer Richard Carrington did observe an enormous solar flare on September 1, 1859. The resulting geomagnetic storm caused widespread disruption to telegraph systems across Europe and North America, with reported electrical fires in telegraph equipment and aurora visible at unusually low latitudes. It remains among the most powerful solar storms in the historical record. Solar physicists do warn that a storm of comparable magnitude today would cause severe disruption to satellite communications, power grids, and other technology dependent on electrical systems. Estimates of potential economic damage vary widely but are consistently large. The Parker Solar Probe and other current solar observation efforts are partly motivated by improving space weather forecasting capability for events of this kind. Whether such an event can be reliably predicted in advance remains an active question in space weather science. Current predictive models can identify conditions that are favorable for large flares but cannot reliably forecast specific events at the scale of the Carrington Event with confidence. The source material proposes that the Carrington Event corresponds to the Enochic description of a moment where the presence inside the vessel briefly exceeds its assigned boundary, using the same vocabulary the text uses for watchers breaking their limits. The linguistic parallel proposed, that the same Ge'ez root is used for both the watcher's descent and the sun's boundary exceedance, is an interpretive claim that requires specialist Ge'ez philological assessment to evaluate. If the parallel is accurate in the original language, it is an interesting compositional feature of the text. Whether it describes foreknowledge of a type of solar event, or reflects a broadly applicable theological vocabulary for boundary violation, is a question that the proposed reading cannot settle. The source material notes that the astronomical book includes a description of a final gate where the assigned path changes permanently rather than repeating. This is a genuine feature of the Enochic eschatological framework. The current cosmic arrangement is presented in the text as an assignment with a terminus, not as a permanent condition. This is consistent with the broader Enochic worldview documented in Nicolsburg's commentary and discussed throughout this channel's series on the Enochic tradition. The Enochic texts consistently frame the current order of the cosmos as provisional, maintained by active angelic administration, subject to disruption, and pointed toward a final transformation rather than eternal continuity. This is a genuine and documented theological position within Second Temple Jewish literature, not a specific prediction about solar physics. What can be independently verified? The Astronomical Book of First Enoch is a real ancient text with Qumran Aramaic fragments dated to the 3rd century BCE. It describes the sun moving through 12 gates on an assigned schedule, in language that scholars, including Vanderkam, have characterized as unusually systematic and measurement-focused. The coronal heating problem is real and is an active area of solar physics research. Parker Solar Probe's switchback findings are real and published in peer-reviewed form. The Maunder Minimum is documented in historical sunspot records and studied in climate science. The Carrington Event of 1859 is documented history. Solar physicists do warn that a Carrington-scale event today would cause severe infrastructure disruption. What has not been independently verified? The specific Ge'ez translation rendering of the interior description as the burning one who is kept. The linguistic parallel between watcher boundary violation and solar boundary exceedance in the original Ge'ez. Whether the text's gate-narrowing description was intended to describe solar cycle anomalies. None of these proposed correspondences have been assessed in peer-reviewed Enoch scholarship or solar physics. What this documentary does not endorse, the claim that the coronal heating problem confirms the Enochic description of a contained presence. The claim that the Maunder Minimum was a deliberate regulation of the sun's output. The claim that the Carrington Event was a boundary exceedance in the sense the Enochic text describes. Each of these is a proposed correspondence between real data and an interpretive reading of an ancient text. The source material for this documentary includes a genuine mid-script disclaimer that is worth acknowledging directly, because it is more honest than most scripts in this genre. The author states plainly that they are not claiming a literal being is trapped inside the sun, that NASA has not confirmed the Book of Enoch, and that reading modern physics into 2,000-year-old poetry is easy to do and easy to get wrong. That disclaimer represents an intellectual honesty that this documentary's standard treatment is designed to support and reinforce, not to undermine. The source material's genuine caution about its own proposed correspondences is the right posture. This documentary's role is to separate what the text genuinely contains from what is proposed, to state the science accurately, and to leave the interpretive question honestly open. The Astronomical Book of Enoch is one of the most genuinely unusual documents in the ancient Jewish literary record. A text focused not on narrative, not on moral instruction, but on systematic measurement of celestial motion, preserved with repetitive precision that scholars have consistently found more consistent with a technical record than with religious poetry. The solar science discussed in this documentary, the coronal heating problem, the switchbacks, the Maunder Minimum, the Carrington Event, represents real and genuinely fascinating open questions in modern astrophysics. Each of these is worth understanding on its own terms. Whether the ancient text and the modern science point toward the same underlying reality, or whether the correspondences between them reflect a broadly applicable metaphor of containment and regulation that can be mapped onto many physical systems, is a question that honest engagement with both the text and the science cannot currently resolve. The sun does what it does, rising, crossing, setting, regardless of what any text says about what is inside it. The corona remains hotter than it should be. The switchbacks continue. And the oldest surviving systematic description of the sun's movement across the sky, preserved in Ethiopia for over 1,000 years, still describes it as something governed rather than something simply burning. That is genuinely worth sitting with. And sitting with an open question, honestly, is where understanding begins.